This week we will be talking about the central nervous system, and it is made up of the brain, which is fundamentally the cranium of the cranial cavity, and the spinal cord. The spinal cord has a series of nerves that come out from it called the spinal nerve. These are shown in this picture right here. These are the spinal cords, and each spinal nerve has a posterior portion and an anterior portion of the spinal nerve, and these transmit signals from the spinal cord to the body and from the body to the spinal cord. Above the foramen magnum, which is where the spinal cord enters the brain, is the brain stem, and the nerves that come out from the brain stem are called cranial nerves, and they're shown right here and up here and along here. And you see the names of all these cranial nerves along the line here. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you memorize these cranial nerves, although as a medical student I had to remember these. The brain is also covered by a series of coverings known as meninges. The most important of these is the outer meninges, known as the dura mater, which just is Latin for tough mother. It's a flexible, tough membrane that protects the brain. In the middle is a thin network of fibers known as the arachnoid matter. And then this is where the cerebral spinal fluid flows and circulates around the brain and spinal cord. And then a very delicate membrane, which is directly on the brain, is called the pia mater. The central nervous system, in addition to having neurons, is also supported by a series of supportive cells known as glial cells. And these glial cells work to support the central nervous system cells, nerve cells, and insulate these nerve cells. And you can see here oligodendrocytes, which are the insulating cells, or forming insulation or myelin around these brain capillaries, as well as around the nerve cells. The neurons also make up part of the central nervous system, and they are made up of various parts. The neuron cell body, which is shown here, the nucleus in the middle of the neuron cell body, the dendrites, which are these sprigs or branches that come out from the neuron cell body that receive, keyword there is receive, signals from other neurons or from other sources. And then the single axon, which comes out from the neuron cell body and leads away from the neuron cell body and transmits the nervous signal away from the neuron cell body. And you can imagine each of these potentially attaching itself to another neuron or to a muscle cell. Brain is made up of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is the neuron cell bodies, as shown here. The white matter is the axons and glial cells, shown down here. And the gray matter also has the myelin, which we talked about before, being produced by the glial cells that act as insulation. And we will talk about myelin at least a couple more times during this talk. A mass of neuron cell bodies outside the brain is called a ganglia, and a network of interconnecting neural cells or neural fibers is called a plexus. Two prominent plexi are present in the body. One is the brachial plexus, which is in the shoulder, and the other is the sacral plexus, which is in the pelvis. In the central nervous system, if you have a group of neuron cell bodies that are located together and act for a single purpose, they're called a nerve center. In the medulla, there are several of these nerve centers. There's the respiratory nerve center. There's something called the nucleus ambiguus, and various other nerve centers. Sensory neurons are those neurons that transmit signals from the body to the central nervous system, while motor neurons transmit signals from the central nervous system to the muscles. And between those two are neurons that are called interneurons, and these act to relay signals between neurons. This is an example of a reflex arc. I will show this again in a few more slides just because I want to make sure you remember it. But a reflex arc starts with a sensory neuron that picks up a signal from the skin or from another area of the body. It could be the patellar tendon, etc. This sensory signal moves along the sensory pathway until it reaches an interneuron. The interneuron relays the signal to a motor neuron, which relays the motor response to this muscle in this case. Now, reflex arcs are important because you'll notice that the brain is not included in this. You don't think about reflex actions. For example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you don't have to think about it being hot. Your hand just automatically is moved away, and that occurs through a reflex arc. The idea here being that the time it takes to travel through one sensory neuron, through an interneuron, and into the motor neuron is much quicker than if it had to go through the central nervous system to process the signal. And so the reflex arc is a protective mechanism that helps us react quickly to things that are potential dangers. In the brain, there's a tight seal of capillary walls that prevent various infectious agents as well as certain drugs from entering the brain or the central nervous system, and this is called the blood-brain barrier. Meningitis, when it occurs, can actually cause a disruption of the blood-brain barrier. Now remember, I told you last week that itis is inflammation, okay? And remember that means the classical signs of inflammation of pain, swelling, redness, and increased temperature. Meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges, or the dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid. Now this can lead to something called coma, and coma is a decrease in consciousness level. And this can be totally passed out so that you have no awareness of your outside surroundings, or it could be just a decrease where you may have some perception of outside surroundings but not full perception. A viral infection of the motor neurons is called poliomyelitis. Now, again, itis is inflammation. Myel is the one of the words or one of the doctor words for the spinal cord or spinal nerves. And so this is a poliovac virus that causes a inflammation of the spinal nerves, particularly the motor neurons. Poliomyelitis was an absolute plague in the United States before the vaccine for poliomyelitis was developed by Jonas Salk. It caused severe disability, and it unfortunately attacked children more than anything else. And many of these children ended up crippled. Others ended up on iron lungs, which was the ventilators or respirators at the time, because the motor neurons that were attacked, you could not necessarily predict what motor neurons were attacked. And if the motor neurons that were attacked were associated with the diaphragm, then the person could no longer breathe on their own. FDR was probably the most famous person I can think of who had poliomyelitis. Now, the peripheral nervous system basically encompasses all the nerves that are outside the spinal cord and the brain. So it's outside the central nervous system. Two of those important nerves are the sciatic nerve, which is the nerve that leads from the spinal cord to the foot, the cranial nerves, which lead from the brainstem to various parts of the neck, head, and face, and spinal nerves, which lead from the spinal cord to the body. Now, many of these nerves are mixed, which means they have both sensory and motor components. They have fibers from sensory neurons, and they have fibers from motor neurons. And so there's generally a single nerve that you would see in the peripheral nervous system is not purely sensory or purely motor, but carries both components. The other aspect of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary functions of the body, including the heart and other organs. This originates in the hypothalamus, which is the area of the brain that controls our autonomic or involuntary nervous functions. There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There is the sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight system. It increases body activities. It increases your awareness. It increases your heart rate, your ventilatory rate, and essentially jazzes up the whole engine of your body so that you can either fight a danger or escape a danger. And then the parasympathetic system, which essentially shuts down the sympathetic system and decreases all these activities. So what is the structure of a typical nerve? A typical nerve would be one such as the median nerve. The median nerve is a nerve that controls the muscles in the hand and arm. You have nerve cells in the median nerve and nerve cell fibers, which are shown here. These neurons cannot or almost never reproduce. That is, they do not divide and produce new neurons. And then the other part of this are these cells here, which are Schwann cells. And Schwann cells are cells that produce this insulation, which is known as myelin. This insulation allows for increased nerve conductivity and nerve conduction velocity. In the central nervous system, the Schwann cells of the central nervous system are called oligodendrocytes, and they produce the myelin for the central nervous system cell. Multiple sclerosis is an attack on the myelin system and an attack on the glial cells. It represents an immune invasion, much like rheumatoid arthritis, but instead of the joints being attacked, it's these glial cells, and the myelin is disturbed, and because of that, the nerve cell function is hampered. This can lead to paralysis or an inability to move muscles, and it causes a decrease in the action potential speed. Now, what do I mean by action potential? Action potential is a wave of electromagnetic activity, electrochemical activity. The top shows an axon at rest, and at rest, the outside of the axon is positively charged and the inside of the axon is negatively charged. And when a nerve process or a nerve signal comes down the neuron, this charge is reversed, and the reversal of charge is the cause of the transmission of an impulse. And you can see that what happens is the inside becomes positive and the outside becomes negative. And then this propagates down the neuron until it reaches the end here. And during this time, you see that this wave of positive-negative reversal moves down the cell, and there's a restoration of the negative and positive behind it. And then at the end, you reach what's known as a synapse, which is a space between the end of the neuron, the axon of the neuron, and the next neuron, or a space between this and the muscle cell, if it ends on a muscle cell, is called is either a neural junction or a neuromuscular junction, and then a chemical known as a neurotransmitter, which we have mentioned before, leads to the passage of the impulse to the next nerve cell or to the muscles. Now, there are inhibitors of nerve impulses, and one of them that's fairly well known is called botulinum toxin. Botulinum toxin is a toxin produced by a bacteria that destroys a specific protein and prevents the motor neuron from discharging. And this is called botulism. It's a form of food poisoning where the bacteria that produces the toxin is in the food. It grows up and leads to the production of the toxin, and if it's ingested, then the person experiences this neural destruction. The bacteria itself is known as Clostridium botulinum. It's an anaerobic organism, which means it grows in low oxygen environment, and it produces the botulinum toxin. Another degenerative disease that occurs in the brain is called Parkinson's disease. It occurs in a specific area called the substantia nigra in the brain, and this leads to a problem of stiffness, motor dysfunction, and tremors. The problem has to do with a lack of a neurotransmitter known as dopamine, which is why patients take a drug called DOPA or L-DOPA in order to treat this problem. I had mentioned the reflex before. This is the automatic response that occurs when certain situations come up. It's an automatic neuromuscular response not requiring the central nervous system. The reflex arc is the simplest nerve pathway and is responsible for this reflex.